Well, welcome to West End Resilience Live. Following the Prime Minister's announcement yesterday that the hospitality sector can open on Saturday, the 4th of July, we are pleased to welcome Kate Nicholls, who is Chief Executive of UKHospitality. With her team, Kate has been working tirelessly throughout the pandemic to ensure that the UK's pubs, restaurants and hotels are supported by the government and are ready to reopen safely and viably next Saturday. It is a day I know that many of us are looking forward to. After we've heard from Kate, we will of course be taking questions from you to her. But first, let's cross over to Jace Tyrrell, Chief Executive of New West End Company. Over to you, Jace.
Martin, thank you, and good afternoon, West Enders, the members, partners and friends of the West End. You're joining us this afternoon, which is actually the last of our weekly West End Resilient Live sessions with Microsoft. We're going to move to monthly moving forward. So I wanted to take this opportunity to thank Martin, who has been our host right throughout the last 10 sessions, our 11th today, and also our friends at Microsoft, who've been instrumental in ensuring we could produce these series right through the lockdown period as we move into our recovery. So a milestone for the West End with retail now reopened, and we've had a really positive response from colleagues returning and customers to the various measures we've worked with you on right across the district to sort of build that confidence to come back to the West End, and obviously COVID secure measures. But we know we need the all-important hospitality sector to really help drive the West End over this summer and into our recovery. So it's very timely we talked to Kate today around how hospitality will open across the country, but all importantly in the West End. And I've had it on very good authority speaking to Westminster councillors this afternoon that tomorrow in the House of Commons they'll be laying legislation on how deregulation could happen over the summer in terms of outdoor trading, in terms of planning and licensing. So once that is laid out before the House of Commons, hopefully this week we'll see some measures and detail from Westminster City Council on how individual businesses right across the West End can apply and work with this period to allow customers and colleagues to dine and visit our outdoor areas. So we have worked hand in hand with Kate over the last 3 months with a number of Westminster bids, really helping to give the West End experience from you, our members, and to help with the guidance on reopening the hospitality sector. And we'll continue to work with Kate and her colleagues as we work through this recovery. So we're really thrilled that Kate has the time to be with us today to give us all an update and answer your questions. So Kate, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jason. Thank you for inviting me here today. It does feel very odd when you're all coming to the end of your crisis management and reopening schedule that we are just about to start ours, having had the very good news yesterday that we were all waiting for, not only that the 4th of July is our opening date, but crucially that we've got movement on that social distancing measure, which would have caused so much challenge for the hospitality sector, moving from 2 metres to 1 metre plus. And I'll come on and talk to that a little bit more. But just by way of introduction, I'm sure you all know about the breadth and depth of hospitality, but I did want to just start by putting it in context, because hospitality has been at the forefront of everybody's concerns as we've been going through this coronavirus crisis, and equally has been right at the top of ministerial concerns. And I think I did an interview on the TV earlier today where gym owners were concerned about the fact that they had to remain closed. And the question came from one of the presenters about why was hospitality being prioritised? Why was hospitality such a big concern for ministers? And somebody very flippantly said it was to do with the amount of tax that was paid on alcohol. However, just to put it in context, hospitality is the 3rd largest employer in the UK. 3.2 million people in the UK rely on hospitality directly for their work. And then we've got a huge hinterland of our supply chain, everything through from small artisan producers, major food manufacturers, distribution, logistics, but also there is the wider community within which we sit, for whom we are a really important sister service: retail, culture, the arts, heritage and office life, all of which benefit from having hospitality alongside them. So we're a £130 billion turnover industry. That means we're bigger than aerospace, automotive and pharmaceuticals put together. In terms of employment, we employ twice as many people as work in financial services. And in terms of those taxes, a £40 billion tax bill that comes from the industry each and every year is the equivalent of the entire social care budget. When you come to somewhere like Westminster, we're actually second largest employer. So it's a really important part of the West End, and as I say, a support service for the other real core tourism, retail and leisure industries within the West End. So, you know, my answer back is sort of, why wouldn't you have that as top of your priority list? And when it comes to the West End, so much of that is driven by inbound tourism. 70 to 80% of our hotels and our tourist attractions are inbound tourism spend. Tourism is our third largest export earner. People who come over to stay in the West End and other parts of the UK, but, you know, let's not beat around the bush. London is the honeypot for most people coming over as a foreign visitor. They spend more in our pubs, bars, restaurants and hotels when they are over here than we have in terms of export earnings from our entire food and drink sector put together. So hugely important industry. And that's why I think the driver behind how can we get this reopen, because of the fact that COVID had hit it so hard. So particularly for the leisure sector and the hospitality sector in the West End, we started to feel the effects back in February with the downturn in economic tourism, but also the downturn in business tourism, and a move by a lot of multinational industries to start the move to work from home well ahead of the government changing its mind about various aspects of lockdown in middle of March. So our sector was first into this crisis. It will be last out of it, and it will take a long time to recover. So it will be a long, slow recovery. 4th of July marks the starting point for that, and we do anticipate that lots of venues will seek to open on that first opening weekend. However, I think it will be slower in central London, and it will be slower as we move through into sort of tourism season. The look and feel of our tourism and hospitality venues will also be very different. The guidance that we had published overnight, past midnight, I think, for those businesses who were sitting with bated breath looking at what they would have to do, does look about a different feel. So much more pre-booking, much more reservations, much less informality, much less spontaneity. Again, I think probably slightly different in the London market, because London is a more pre-booked hospitality experience than it is in a lot of other suburban neighbourhood locations and indeed other town centres. But that is the main difference. So a move towards online ordering, a move to pre-booking, a move to online payment, contactless payment, suggestion of where possible as much table service as possible, certainly a seated consumption where possible in our pubs and bars. So a very different feel. Crucially, therefore, for London pubs and bars, it's going to be vital that we get that reopening and the outside and turning the streets and the premises inside out. It will be really important that that happens quickly, smoothly, and ideally that it is a full deregulation, so that if you have a permission to trade inside, you can automatically trade in your outside areas, whether you are licensed for them or not at the present point in time. And equally, a sensible, pragmatic, low light touch, low red tape version of applying for outside permissions, so that we have a sensible and pragmatic response to allowing and actually encouraging people to drink and eat outside. Sometimes that hasn't always been an easy relationship with local residents and local authorities, so we're working with local enforcement partners to make sure that we get that right and that we free up these businesses to give them the capacity to thrive. Particularly important in central London, I think we tend to think about hospitality businesses in London as being the driver of growth, very successful, some of our best known brands in terms of hotels, bars and restaurants. However, that is not going to be the case this time round. Those businesses and London in the centre have traditionally driven us out of recession and dragged the rest of the country up. That is not going to be the case here. London hospitality has been hit, as I say, earliest, will take longer to recover because there's a triple whammy. We did a recent survey of consumers, including asking them about working from home. 50% of us are working from home at the moment. And when it comes to London, 2/3 are intending to work from home right until the end of the year. So we are not seeing a return to office work. We're not seeing a return to opening up of offices, and the constraint on public transport and that central message from government that if you can go into work, you can only do so if you can't travel on public transport, a real inhibitor of reopening office space within central London. Secondly, we have continued closure of our cultural and music venues, theatres, the heart of the West End. Although we're going to have some reopening of galleries and museums, that will be quite gradual. So that those core anchor activities that people would come into the West End for, they're remaining closed. So you have a drag there. And then third and finally, foreign visitors. As I say, our hotels particularly reliant upon foreign inbound visitors, and while quarantine is in place, that will be a deterrent for foreign visitors booking well into the autumn, beyond the period in which closures and restrictions are in place. So I had a meeting this morning with Central London hotels. 25% of them as individual sites anticipate opening up in July, 35% in August, 40% in September. So it's going to be a staggered and phased reopening, which has a knock-on impact when it comes to looking at what happens with retail and the sort of West End experience. So that will also impact upon the opening of pubs, bars and restaurants. All of our national chains are telling us that London will be the slowest to reopen for them. They are planning their phased reopening, and the centre of London they are anticipating will be well down their list of openings until you get some more footfall, until you get some more demand. So I think we are all caught in this chicken and egg situation for a little bit longer, and that's going to be hugely challenging. So we do need all stakeholders, government, the mayor, the industry, to work together to make sure that we can start to stimulate demand, encourage people to come back in, encourage Londoners to come back in. You know, if you follow the rules strictly at the moment, I live in Ealing, I shouldn't really be coming into the centre of London if I can't use it, if the only way to do it is public transport. Now that we have to get back to allowing Londoners to come back in and enjoy London West End. I'm sure lots of people are, but we do have those inhibitors, those breaks, those mixed messages coming forward. We also need to then look at foreign visitors. And finally, for the West End, there are various activities and business activities that remain closed, and we have no real timeline for some of them reopening. So for our hotels, leisure facilities remain closed, which is a key driver of booking. It's one of the ones that goes first. They attract the highest prices. It's where you would look to spend your money if the hotel has a pool, a leisure facility, a gym. Those are all remaining closed, possibly until towards the end of July. And then more importantly, for the hotels that comprise the core estate in the West End, you don't have an opening date back for business activities such as meetings, events, conference and banqueting, business events, large scale events. A lot of money tied up and already contracted for events in Q4, which is now looking vulnerable unless we can get some certainty from government around reopening. So this sector is going to need some continued support. We are going to be continuing asking government to be able to support us, as I say, the mayor as well, particularly for central London. Some key issues coming up, as well as the reopening of outdoor areas that Jace talked about. We do have a fiscal stimulus event, a speech by the Chancellor, 8th of July, and we're going to be asking there for greater support, in particular a VAT cut, temporary VAT cut for tourism to stimulate demand, and additional support we will need, I think, in order to get us through a potential bloodbath on rents, which affects not just our sector, but also retail at the heart of the West End. We're going to need some additional support for those businesses to get through it. If we don't, we're going to have a rent debt which will result in persistent economic scarring and longer term redundancies as we go out into the autumn. So if they don't want to have an anchor dragging on growth, we need support and stimulus there. So those are the key areas that we're talking about to government and the challenges that we're grappling with as we come into our reopening phase. Still quite a few of our businesses needing to reopen, still a lot of them likely to remain closed when you look at nightclubs, music venues and some of the leisure activities. So we look forward to continuing that programme of reopening. Thank you.
Kate, thank you. Don't forget, we do want to hear from you. We want your questions to Kate. All you need to do is click on the question mark icon, which you can see at the bottom of your webinar window, type in the question and put it to Kate. And if you can put your name and details in, that would be brilliant as well. Let's look first of all at a question from Simon Thomas from the Hippodrome. Thank you, Simon, for engaging, as you often have in all of our webinars. Central London's late night economy problems are being made worse by the congestion charge being extended into the evenings and weekends. How can we address this? This is something which has come up again and again. Any thoughts from you, Kate?
Yes, it is a big challenge, and unfortunately the industry finds itself caught in a spat almost between the Mayor's Office and Transport for London and central government, which is never a comfortable place to be. I do think we need to come together as a whole sector and as a whole series of industries to push really hard for a London plan, a central London plan. We are going to need investment to kickstart London. We are going to need a concerted effort to get London open. Central London is always quieter in a number of places during August. So we really need to work to get people to come back into the centre of London. And I really fear that unless the mayor and the government work together, we're going to have a hollowed out West End where we're just prepared to let it drift. And I do think that tackling the congestion charge is one of the areas that we need to work on together and get a very strong letter. So I think we need a concerted campaign bringing together retailers, the sort of entertainment industry, the cultural sector, the heritage sector, and hospitality, to see what we can do to put together a series of planned steps to open up and encourage investment back into the centre of London. And I think we just need to try and find a way through that congestion charge issue.
Thank you for that, Kate. Let's cross to this question here. What can we expect about the relationship between tenants and landlords? Not a very specific question, but the more specific you can make them, the better. But Kate, any thoughts about the relationship between tenants and landlords?
Well, it's never an easy one, is it? Even in the best of times. So it's one of those areas where our regulatory framework has found to be lacking. And I think that that's one of the things that we should keep hold of as we come out of this crisis. There are certain things that have proved not to be fit for purpose. The business rates regime is a clear one of them. I think the Landlord and Tenant Act is another one. These are outdated. They're not fit for purpose in a modern economy. So if we're pressing reset, we should reset the regulatory framework. Three quick updates. One is the corporate insolvency and the insolvency and corporate governance bill is currently going through the House of Lords, should be completed towards the end of this week. Government has agreed to amend that to provide protection retrospectively for winding up petitions and statutory demands for non-payment of debt, not just rent, but obviously rent is the big one. That will be extended until the 30th of September. So that piece of legislation should be going on the statute books now. That also includes a new provision, a sort of Chapter 11 protection for company moratoriums. You can put yourself into suspended animation for about 20 days while you need to reschedule or restructure finance or debt. Presumably rent could be one of them, short of falling into a CVA, and then you could come out with a new plan for how you're going to deal with it, and the courts can bind dissenting creditors to it. So there is a new tactic that could be used to ease up that relationship, unless we start to get people coming to the negotiating table sensibly. So that protection against winding up petitions after the 27th of April, protection against statutory demands backdated to the 1st of March. Another extension is the lease forfeiture moratorium, also extended to the 30th of September. So the action a landlord can take for non-payment of rent in this quarter day is restricted by government until the 30th of September. That buys us a breathing space, and the government has introduced a new code of practice to encourage landlords and tenants to come together and try and negotiate a way out of this. I'm not sure that that will be able to be achieved unless we have a willingness on both sides to step away from a position of either I need my full rent or no rent, but also unless you've got some kind of incentive or some kind of mandation from government. So new tools, new protections, but we're still not untying the Gordian knot. So I think that there's a space until the 30th of September to work that out and try and find a resolution.
Okay, thank you. A couple of questions about licensing, one of which is anonymous and the other which is from Sarif and Anthony from Bagatelle. Let's go to Sarif and Anthony's question first. How does the City of Westminster's licensing compare against central government, as it seems like it's very subjective at an enforcement level? And then another question about licensing. A key in central London is a relaxation of the licensing and outdoor seating regulations. We've already been talking about this already. Have you gained any assurance from Westminster City Council that they will adopt a light touch and very quick approach to applications for outside dining, as anecdotally I'm hearing of a heavy hand being applied, which is extremely counterproductive?
Do you want me to pick that up? And then I think, Jace, you were saying you would want to come in as well. On the first point, obviously there is a conflict, slightly, not necessarily a conflict, there's a difference between central government licensing and local government licensing. The central government licensing framework does just that. It sets the framework, it sets the guidance. Westminster decides how it's going to interpret that on the ground, and Westminster does have a different approach to other London boroughs, to other licensing authorities. That is how the government envisaged it working, so that it could take account of specific local circumstances. We've yet to see the full detail of what the government's plans are for deregulation of outside areas. There are a number of proposals that have been put forward for a sort of wide-ranging deregulation that would allow anybody to use their outside areas that they control and own. There's a difference between the areas that they control and own and the public highway. To allow them, with even if they didn't have proper planning permission or licensing permission, to be able to have a sort of notification approach. And then there is the public highway. Westminster has set out a series of zones and sort of temporary event notices of how they envisage it operating and opening, so that you can have temporary permissions. I do urge them to make sure, and we have tried to urge them in previous meetings, to make sure that there is a light touch. The intention behind this legislation is a temporary freeing up to save businesses. I would hate to see Westminster take its normal approach and apply that to what is a crisis and emergency situation when these businesses are struggling to survive. Otherwise, they will find that they don't have a viable hospitality industry to come back to.
Jace, are you coming in now? Yeah.
Just to add to that, I mean, Kate's absolutely right, and sort of been lobbying on two fronts, really. On the national legislation, which, as I said earlier, we should be seeing that before the House tomorrow, which is obviously for the whole country. But the uniqueness is the West End and Westminster Council is very different perhaps to other parts of England or the UK. And there's obviously local interpretation around licensing and planning. I think we've been very encouraged by Westminster's approach. They published their plans last week before the government has published what they're looking to do. They're wanting to bring the industry together to apply. I think from everything we heard from the leader of the council last week and Councillor Matthew Green is they recognise this as temporary. They recognise this as a crisis. They want to balance the need of residents and business. So let's see the detail, which hopefully we'll see this week from Westminster Council. But certainly it feels politically they understand the crisis we're operating in. And also I asked the question of Councillor Green this morning around the resources, because that was also their concern, if there's lots of paperwork to apply. And he reassured me that they are geared up for this. And they're going to be flexible and make sure they can support the business as much as they can. So let's see that detail, which obviously we'll share as well. And just to echo Kate's point, very much in favour of central London coming together. There's still some very big issues in the 2 or 3 months ahead, never mind next year, that we need to get some traction on in policy. So full support from the Westminster bids behind Kate and her effort to really help the hospitality sector in the weeks and months ahead.
And I would just add on that, just a final point on the outside areas. I was really quite heartened when the Westminster guidance came out and there was misunderstanding about outside drinking and standing up outside drinking. They were quick to clarify that, and they were quick to squash any rumours that they might be wanting to stop people standing outside pubs, which is a sort of uniquely London experience. And so I'm heartened by the fact that they took that seriously. They were quick off the mark to say that they didn't intend to restrict that, and I hope that that feeds through in how they're applying it going forward.
Okay, it's an interesting point that you just made there, because I think it ties in with a question being made by, or a point being made by David Kaner, and it is as follows. West End hospitality businesses are already trading outside the premises using off sales and are causing significant problems for residents. Why should residents expect things to be better, especially if there is deregulation of outside trading? Do you have any thoughts, comments on that point?
Well, we've been pulling together a large number of groups over the course of the last 4 to 5 weeks to be able to make sure that we can be ready to reopen, ready with a warm welcome, but a safe and a responsible one to make sure that we tackle any problems head on. We have also pulled together an enforcement group, bringing in the Met Police, licensing officers, licensing solicitors and representatives of the industry to work through good practice guidelines on how you manage off sales, how you manage outside areas, what kind of proportionate controls we could volunteer as an industry, particularly around timings. I think we are all going to have to make concessions and understand that it is not going to operate in the way that we might entirely like it to operate. but it is only for a short period of time. And, I think we are going to have to be collaborative, work with our residents to understand their concerns, to put in place the measures to protect them. And equally, we hope that the residents can then support the local businesses, because those facilities, those community assets, those tax generators will be lost forever unless we can support them through this summer. And it is only this summer. This is not a permanent state of being.
A question here, are there clear guidelines for hosting small events within a retail environment and guidelines for catering companies to follow?
At the moment, you can't do small events. So the restriction at the moment for hospitality is that you still are working within the parameters of what we can do socially outside in our own homes or in our own gardens. So that is groups of no more than 2 households coming together, or 6 people from different households. So that is the government restriction. There's an absolute ban on gatherings of more than 30 people. That is gatherings in one event or activity. But as far as we know at the moment, no business events, no get-togethers, hosting of events of more than those two family groups.
Okay, question here, which I'm not sure it's something that you can directly address, but you might have some thoughts on it. We are a hospitality recruitment agency, and some hotels have refused to settle invoices due before lockdown until they reopen. How does the sector feel about this? It's very distressing. Some 5-star international hotel groups are included.
Well, we're always encouraging our businesses to make sure that they pay their debts and to pay their outstanding balances. I'll happily pick up with any individual companies that need support, particularly if they are a small supply chain. Late payment is one of the issues that is a particular concern across the sector, particularly for small businesses. And I know how important it is to business survivability. Hopefully now we've got those opening dates and some certainty, we can make sure that those invoices are settled.
Okay. Question here from somebody who hasn't given their name, but an interesting point they're making nevertheless. My customers are 90% office workers. I can't reopen until they return. How can we persuade the mayor and government to gradually, safely allow commuters to return to central London, which currently looks like a ghost town?
Well, this is the big challenge that I alluded to beforehand. Until you change that central message that says, if you can work from home, you should. And if you have to come into work, you shouldn't go on public transport. We are always going to have a problem in central London. In central London, 70% of us travel into work by public transport. It's the opposite way around for the rest of the country. So most people outside of London, it isn't a problem. They're travelling not on public transport. So we do need to have a good, honest, robust dialogue between the Department for Transport, the Mayor's Office, the unions and the industrial sectors that rely upon this, because until we get London kick-started, we are going to have a problem in retail and hospitality, because as I say, you are not going to get those businesses reopening. Either, businesses in central London who could reopen in hospitality on the 4th of July are just going to wait, or they're going to open and go bust slowly. If you see, it's either go bust quickly or go bust slowly. But when you've seen companies like Pret and the grab and go people who've opened up, they are so travel dependent and so office dependent that it's impossible to be able to make a success of those businesses on such small revenues that are coming in. So I think this is part of, now we've got the reopening dates sorted, this is part of the action plan to kickstart central London.
Just a reminder, you can still put your questions to Kate. All you need to do is click on the question mark icon, type your question there, and then we will put it hopefully to Kate directly. A question here from Stuart Young. And what Stuart is asking about is the system whereby a lot of salary is made up in the hospitality by tips, and the way that they are not included, I think, in the furlough pay and the calculations for furlough. Is there any sign of there being any movement on that, Kate, or is the government sticking by the current plan not to include that?
At the moment, the government is sticking very strongly with the current plan not to amend that. And even when we move to part-time furlough, where you'll have some of your wages coming in from work and some from furlough, they're not going to change that either when you look at the normal working hours and the normal salary. There is a potential, as I say, as we come out of the whole economy solutions and they start to look at hospitality specific solutions, or sector specific solutions, I should say, there's a possibility that they may change their mind, but they're not showing any signs of it yet.
Actually, there's another question here on the subject of furlough pay from Ray Newton from Edwardian Hotels, and he says, if Kate has not already covered it, is there any chance, however slim, of furlough being exceptionally extended for the hospitality sector?
It's possible, but again, the message we're getting back from the Treasury is furlough is a full economy solution, and it'll wind down, and then we'll look at additional sector specific support that might be needed, and furlough is not the only type of support. So I think, you know, we'll see what happens when it comes out as a package, but we are saying to the government quite clearly, we need parity of treatment for hospitality and the other events and business activities that are remaining closed. So everybody else in the economy had 2 full months access to full furlough after they'd restarted. Whether they chose to reopen or not, or chose to go back to work, they still had access to 80% furlough. So we want the same in hospitality, and certainly those sectors, if they are later at starting, if live music doesn't return or nightclubs don't return until September, October, it's going to be really challenging for them if they don't have access to full furlough. So we're asking for a commitment from government if they are keeping a sector closed, casinos being the obvious one in the centre of London as well. Then why can they not have access to 80% furlough for longer?
I want to return, because he's been such a steady contributor of questions, to Simon from the Hippodrome. He's raising the issue of casinos and how important they are for the West End's entertainment, and the fact that I think that they are remaining shut. Do you have any kind of inside thoughts, ideas about when they will be reopening?
I know that the government is looking at indoor leisure, casinos and bowling alleys, and is looking to review those that sort of seem quite anomalous later in July. So I think that we can hopefully get casinos open end of July, beginning of August. I understand that a lot of those issues were to do around the optics of it, rather than there being any sense of logic. And I also understand that if venues like casinos, and this may not be possible, but if they wanted to open just as a bar or a restaurant, they would be able to do that, providing they can meet the social distancing requirements and the COVID secure guidelines that other high street bars and restaurants are also meeting. Okay.
In terms of the hospitality companies, my understanding is not all of them are going to be opening on the 4th of July. Do you have any indicators as to which of them, whether it's the chains which are choosing not to open up all of their restaurants, or what the situation is in terms of, is there a pattern in terms of who's opening up what and where and when?
The pattern is more to do with location. So all the consumer sentiment research that we've undertaken shows that particularly if you're looking at London, people are more likely to go out locally, and certainly if they can avoid public transport. So I think there's about 47% of consumers said that when they were planning to go out, they were looking to go out locally, not on public transport for a meal or a drink with friends. And so I think that dictates both the location, but also the type and style. So the West End is made up of many little villages, really, and you can see how some of the independent neighbourhood, traditional style bars, restaurants may well still be able to flourish and reopen early on because of the type of clientele they have coming through with them, and you'll see that across London. So it doesn't seem to depend on whether it's chain or independent, it's driven more by the location and the style of operation.
Okay, question here from Sophie from the Wallace collection. So far, a lot of the discussion on hospitality is centred on restaurants and hotels, but when or in which phase of the reanimation of the industry do you think corporate and private events, large-scale receptions, dinners, weddings, etc., may be viable again? Do you think the guidelines for seated service, as in pubs and bars, will impact the types of events we will see, i.e. more seated dinners rather than standing receptions with 100+ guests?
Okay, so this is the big unknown at the moment, and it's a sort of $64 million question. If we had 3 phases of reopening the normal parts of the economy, or the bulk of the economy, where you are not mixing necessarily for a long period of time with lots of strangers, that's what's driven the government reopening plans to date. You've then probably got 3 phases of hospitality that is reopening, and unfortunately events, corporate events, banqueting, large mass gatherings are towards the end of that. The good news is that the government is differentiating between business events, organised business events, exhibitions, conferences, seated dinners, where you can trace who's attended, and is more concerned about the mass gatherings that sort of, sports activity, uncontrolled mass gatherings, crowded by design are the places that they are concerned about. So I think, yes, you are going to be sort of later in the queue in terms of reopening hospitality in terms of corporate events. Corporate events will be ahead of public events, and seated events will be ahead of standing cheek by jowl at various activities. So I think those are the kind of restrictions and the phasings that we will look to see. Our challenge is how quickly can we get those dates confirmed, or indicative dates confirmed, in order to secure future bookings, because obviously corporate events are booked much further out than going to your local pub, bar, or even your hotel. So we need to provide some certainty for those activities that are taking place in the autumn.
Okay, there's more of a statement here, but it's a nice one, so I'm going to read it out from Ray Newton from Edwardian Hotels, thanking Jace and the team for an excellent programme of broadcasts. Thank you, Ray, for the thanks. Let's have a look at another question here. You mentioned that Central London is suffering with slower footfall. What further measures do you think Central London businesses will need? Is there anything that you would add to what you've been talking about already?
I think the main ones are rent, because while you've got suppressed demand and you've got high fixed costs, which most of the West End businesses do have, your only point of flexibility, therefore, is labour. So you are going to have redundancies, and you are going to have business closures unless we can deal with that. You do need a really strong marketing campaign to get people back in. Business rate relief going further forward, so we don't have a second spike in business failures next April. And I do think it's making sure we can get the rest of the infrastructure and the ecosystem up and running, the cultural, the live performances, the business events. We're all going to struggle in the West End if we just stood up one by one. We need the whole infrastructure in place, so we need all the pieces of the jigsaw together.
A point being made, a question here about the fact that many people have moved to buying stuff online, and do you think that that is going to be a permanent shift, or do you think that there will be a significant shift back to wanting to go back into shops?
Oh gosh, fortunately I'm not answering on behalf of shops, so I think the one good thing about hospitality is you can't do it virtually, or it's certainly not the same, as we're all finding on these new calls. I think COVID has probably accelerated a couple of changes that were already happening societally. You are definitely having more and more moving online, and people will get used to that, and people will get used to the ease of it. However, they do like to go back and actually touch and feel, and there are clearly certain shops that you cannot do that with. So I think it's, no surprise that you had big queues outside Primark. They don't have a big online presence. No surprise you had queues outside Nike Town, apart from the fact that you always do. You need to try on shoes. You can't buy them online as easily. I take heart from the fact the other trend I think that will accelerate as COVID has accelerated is working from home and remote working. I don't think we will ever go back to being permanently in the office all the time for most of us. But for hospitality, quite clearly, people are craving social experiences. And I think the challenge for us, and the thing that we're very good at, is providing socially responsible experiences, a curated experience that keeps people safe, provides a hygienic environment, stops them spilling out uncontrolled on streets where they cause more nuisance than they do if they're standing and are managed outside our venues and premises. And there's a question there about toilet facilities. You know, obviously having toilet facilities reopen and having hospitality venues in the West End able to offer that is going to be a big step forward for what's been happening recently. But equally, I take heart from the fact that the first thing we all did when we went into lockdown was stop phoning people on our mobile phones and very rapidly pick up Teams and Zoom. I don't think I'd worked with anybody who really used Teams and Zoom as extensively as we all do now. So we obviously like the face-to-face contact. We like the immediacy. So I take heart from the fact that the one thing we will go back to is a social experience.
Jace, I think you want to come in here.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole ecology, as Kate says, of the West End and these urban cities is the mix of retail, leisure, culture, and we need all those pieces to come together. We know in retail there was a pronounced shift to online happening already, although we know from Verdict and others, actually 80% of transactions still require physical space. And we know that a lot of the retailers had to scale up their digital right through the pandemic and now balance both the physical and online. But for us in the West End, to get back to that 10 billion turnover, which could take years to get us back to there, we need all bits of the West End ecology working, which is so critical to hospitality with the culture and the leisure, and actually new types of experiential, because we know that's going to drive customer demand. And we know for retailers, particularly in the West End, it is their very best manifestation of their brand, their products, their services. So I think there'll be more of that in the future. I think the key this year, as we all know, is to actually survive this year, make sure you can manage your costs and the lower levels of demand, but also repurpose the West End going into 21 and this decade of what customers of the future want. And of course, that's integrating the digital with the physical, which is already happening in retail, but right across as well.
Jace, thanks for that. Just time for one last question, and it's to you, Kate. Will restaurants be allowed to reopen with loo facilities? I know the lack of toilet facilities is a real issue in the West End at the moment.
Yes, it's a very quick answer. Yes, we will be able to reopen all our shared facilities.
Kate, thank you very much indeed for that, and thank you to all of you for joining and for watching and asking all the questions. This, as we've already mentioned, is the final webinar in our weekly series, but we are back on a monthly basis from Wednesday the 29th of July, so do please look out for invitations next month. We started this series to celebrate the strength, sustainability and resilience of the West End and to bring together businesses and employees during a time of adversity. On behalf of New West End Company, we would like to thank you for all joining us on West End Resilience Live over the past 11 weeks and for the resilience and stoic actions of the whole West End community during the lockdown period. For now, thank you for joining us. Goodbye.